Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I wish you enjoyed Dave's first talk of the morning. I know when I first heard Dave speak, it turned many lights on for me. And the Cynefin framework and other work that he's developed is really helpful for me in making more sense of this complex world. So I'd like to try and build on that this morning. I'm endeavoring to be ambitious because I would like to both introduce you to some perspectives but also to offer you some practical tools that maybe you can take away and already start experimenting with when you leave here today. The title of my talk is Creating Conditions for People and Organization to Thrive. There's something wrong with that title because, in my opinion, an organization can't thrive unless there's reciprocity within the system and the people are thriving too. But I think we've learned to set our ambitions low. And often if profitability is adequate, then we underestimate what would be possible were we to focus more on the people too. I'd like to frame what I'm sharing with you today by backing up and saying something about where I've come from. In my mid-20s, I was looking for something more meaningful to do than what I was doing at the time. And when I say meaningful, I wanted to invest my time into something that would have a positive contribution, not just for myself and my immediate community, but for the world at large as well. And that led me to work with children, young people. The project I got involved with was called the Teens and Toddlers program. Some of you might have heard of Aldous Huxley. He was the author of several books, including Brave New World. He and his second wife, Laura Huxley, developed an initiative in the 60s around the idea of human potential. And one of the projects that they established was pairing up teenage parents in disadvantaged areas with elderly and small children to help them learn. And that progressed from just teenage parents to teenagers who were at risk of social exclusion and were inclined statistically to create a child at a young age rather than to explore what else might be meaningful for them. And so in the 90s, that project came over to the UK. It was called Teens and Toddlers, and I worked with them for some years. The basic idea behind the program was to pair up these teenagers who were at risk of social exclusion with young children in nurseries who were also at risk of social exclusion. We had a kind of scaled learning framework in the organization, so we had experienced facilitators who were working with local people as trainee facilitators to learn how to make supportive interventions with the teenagers who work with the small children, and an organization behind that that supported the whole initiative and brought forward the learning of decades into that project to continuously adapt and improve. The underlying philosophy of this program was a potential-orientated approach to learning and development. Aristotle drew an analogy for human potential around the acorn, and his basic hypothesis was that, as with an acorn, you don't tell an acorn how to grow into an oak tree. You focus on creating the conditions in which this acorn can thrive. So potential, in order for it to reveal itself, requires the right conditions to be able to blossom. So, roll forward some years later, looking back retrospectively, it began to become clear to me that there were certain conditions relating to that organizational system that enabled that project to be successful. And it was successful. At that time, statistically, 86% of all teenagers that we worked with were likely to create a teenage pregnancy before the age of 20. And teenage pregnancy in the UK at that time, and still today, is a big issue. And as a result of a 20-week program with those children, we tracked them until the age of 25. Admittedly, some children dropped out of the program because they weren't yet ready to engage, but the majority completed the program, and of that, only 3.6% of those children created a teenage pregnancy. and 86% of them re-engaged with their education and went on to further education and to create much more meaning in their lives. So I want to build my talk a bit around these conditions. I'm going to talk about the value of having a clear why. I'm not talking about goals, just as Dave was warning about today, but situations in the now that appear relevant and we wish to respond to them. Having clear expectations, people understanding what's expected of them, what to expect from others, and vice versa. Clear strategy. I'm not going to say much about strategy today, but having a high-level approach for how you go about responding to the situation that's important for you is valuable. And also a supporting structure. A structure that supports flow of information, distribution of influence, and enables the creation of value by individuals and the organization as a whole. I'd like to talk about responsiveness. Dave spoke earlier about human sensor networks. I'm going to talk something about that. About being focused on the creation of value. After all organizations exist to create value in response to human needs. So let's keep that in mind, the value we're seeking to create. Keeping focus on lifelong learning and development, and the nurturing of a culture of collaboration. So these conditions weren't just relevant to the Teens and Toddlers project, they're also relevant for all organizations. And so, about 7 years ago, having spent many years exploring something called the Sociocratic Circle method, I developed, along with Bernard Bockelbrink and Liliana David, Sociocracy 3.0. We refer to it as social technology for growing agile and resilient organizations. And it says free because this technology has been around for much longer than you and I. And so we try to make all of that available under Creative Commons license. Sociocracy, for those of you who don't know, the term, if you think about it, is very close to democracy. It basically means rule by the social group, from the Latin socius and the Greek kratos, power. People today say that sociocracy points toward a more advanced form of democracy. I'm not sure about that, but for me, sociocracy and democracy are really the same thing. We are the social group. And it's helpful sometimes to come together to collaborate around those unavoidable dependencies upon which we all rely. There's a long history to the term sociocracy. It goes back to 1851. August Compt first coined the term. Compt is a controversial figure, and I'm not advocating for much of his work and thinking, but he anticipated that in future nation-states would need to embrace more of the scientific method in order to be able to make and evolve agreements that serve the needs of all the people, not just the kind of elite or the ruling class. Compt was against democracy. He thought it was corruptible, and his view was that nations would be better governed by social scientists and other experts. He said it was inevitable, and to be honest, these days I question sometimes if he was far wrong. I think the social scientists and other experts have enormous influence. I'll leave it for you to evaluate the utility of that. But still, this recognition of testing hypotheses and moving beyond a fundamentalist feudal perspective was something that Compt brought. Sociocracy went through many iterations via Lester Frank Ward, who considered what would it look like if we kept at center the idea of rule by the social group. Bucher and Betty Cadbury in the early 20th century introducing some of those ideas into schooling, and then in the 70s, Gerard Endenberg, who developed something called the Sociocratic Circle method. And I wonder, could you raise your hands if you've heard of Sociocracy before seeing the program for this conference? Okay, so when I asked this question 10 years ago, there may be one or two hands. So the word has spread. But I think what most of you will understand, unless you're at Octo, around what Sociocracy 3.0 is, Sociocracy is a Sociocratic Circle method and the work of Gerard Endenberg. And I'm going to bash a little bit today the idea of whole system methodologies and frameworks in general. and argue for a more pattern-based approach. Some of you have probably heard of Holacracy also, Brian Robertson, who took many of the ideas of Sociocracy and created his own interesting system for organizational development and change. And then in 2015, quite by coincidence, myself, Liliana David, and Bernard Bockelbrink ended up in a room together where I was introducing people to the Sociocratic Circle method. And it was at that point that Sociocracy 3.0 was conceived. To understand Sociocracy 3.0 in a nutshell, it's basically a collection of patterns, principles, and concepts from Agile, Lean, and Sociocratic methods and frameworks. Okay, so we were curious about the component parts of some of these different methods and frameworks, assuming that there was some wisdom woven into each of them. The question of why Sociocracy 3.0 is helpful to understand the reason why we developed it to start with. And Bernard asked me a question in one of those early occasions. He said, "You've been teaching and introducing people to the Sociocratic Circle method for many years now. Can you give me any examples of companies who stayed with that methodology over time?" And I thought about it for a while, and then I said, "Well, strictly, no." So he asked me, what do they do instead then? And I reflected for a moment and explained, well, they keep what they think works, they adapt things that they think would work better if they adapt them, and they forget about everything else really fast and carry on doing what they always did. And he said, why don't we tell people about that then? So this is how Sociocracy 3.0 was born. We wanted to provide people with options to consider, not prescriptive formulas to follow, when their habitual approach failed to bring about the results they expect or wish to see. Life is so full, you've got more than enough to deal with on a daily basis without considering learning new ways of doing things when what you currently do is good enough. S3 is there to pull in those moments when, despite your best efforts, you're failing to achieve results you would expect or wish to see, and or those results that reveal themselves indicate that you need to pivot in some way. You can build just about every one of the existing methods and scaling frameworks out there, like Holacracy, Sociocratic Circle method. You can install a safe framework with all the bells and whistles, just about anything that you like, but S3 also helps you to enrich your existing approach and develop your own unique way forward. So, I said a menu of patterns. What I mean by a pattern is a practice, process, or guideline for successfully navigating specific contexts. As with any pattern, it's contextually relevant. In S3, we've arbitrarily, for now, divided these 70-plus patterns into 11 categories. Patterns that support sense-making and decision-making, for example, organizing work, enabling co-creation, and so on. And I'm going to reference a few of those today. There's also 7 key principles that we defined in S3. There's many principles. Stephen Covey defined a principle as a guideline for human conduct that's proven to have enduring, permanent value. So principles also relate to rules about how things happen, but in the context we're using them, we're talking about guidelines for behavior. And please bear in mind as I introduce you to these are not a prescription, these are guidelines to consider, constraints that might be valuable to adhere to in moments because they enable you to better achieve your objectives. The principles are equivalence, different to equality. We're not equal as human beings. It's actually why equivalence is useful. To involve people in making and evolving decisions that affect them. Consent. I'll talk more about this later, but essentially it's about seeking out and resolving objections to decisions and actions. We're trained not to object. We're trained not to disagree, to dissent, to argue. Consent invites us to do the opposite. Transparency. Record valuable information and make it accessible unless there's a reason for confidentiality. I'm not an advocate for radical transparency. There's many reasons for confidentiality. But if it's useful, why not have it available for people to see? Accountability. In English, we distinguish between responsibility and accountability. So we're talking about responding when something's needed, doing what you agree to, and accept your share of responsibility, not just for your little siloed bubble, but for the organization as a whole. I'm surprised how often I hear people complain about the organization they're part of, and fair enough, there might be constructive criticism that's important to bring into the consciousness of the system to reveal opportunities to improve, but in the free world, we all make a choice to join an organization, and we share some accountability for its success. If you don't feel that sense of stewardship and care for the organization you're part of, I suggest you think of other ways to spend your short, precious life. Effectiveness, different to efficiency. So devoting time to what brings you closer toward achieving the organization's overall objectives. And going back to some of Compt's influence, but empiricism, testing all assumptions you rely on through experiments and continuous revision. And applying that learning to continuous improvement by regularly reviewing outcomes and making incremental changes to what you do and how you do it based on what you learn. So these principles are like the thread that weaves the fabric of the patterns in S3 together. And when you bump into a situation where your pattern is no longer good enough, you need to revert to a higher order, and principles provide a higher order of constraints to be able to adapt things in a coherent and useful way. Finally, in S3, besides 70 patterns and 7 principles, we also have 6 key concepts, and I'm going to frame the rest of this talk around these concepts today. Concepts provide a common language, but it's important to understand what we mean. I heard Dave say a few years ago now, in complexity, we need to develop new language. I would agree with that. I hear people complain about that idea and say, why can't we just use the terms we have? But language kind of follows our sense-making and meaning-making, and it's important that we continue, adapt that, and improve so that we can have more nuanced and high-resolution exchange. Concepts increase shared understanding, and they enable constructive dialogue between people. So I'm going to explain a bit what these concepts mean today, to us at least. They're driver, domain, governance and operations, objection, and agreement. And I'm sure some of those terms are familiar to you, and I'll explain them more as we go. So, back to these conditions for success. I'm going to start with a clear why. And that brings us to the first concept I shared, which is driver. Driver doesn't mean someone who drives the bus. In fact, what we mean by driver is quite nuanced, but in essence, we're referring to a person or a group's motive for responding to a situation. Apparently, and I haven't counted, but you and I make approximately 30,000 decisions every day. That's 30,000 situations that we perceive, overlay with relevance and meaning, and then respond to in some way. This is what I mean by a driver. A perception of a situation that appears to matter to the one perceiving it in the context in which it occurs. You are a driver spotting entity, so am I, and we'll talk more about that later today. For this talk, it was important for me to understand what the driver was for why I was invited by Ludovic. There was some explanation at the start, but in essence, it was the fact that in recent years, Octo have been using patterns from S3, and they've been finding them useful sometimes to be able to more effectively respond to the challenges and opportunities they face. And on the basis of that situation, they decided that they would experiment with me coming up here to introduce some of you to S3 to help raise your understanding and give you the opportunity to consider whether it would be useful for you as well. That helped me a lot to be able to focus on what I was going to say today, and it also helped you in deciding whether to come, because hopefully you read a description that said something along these lines as well. I'd like to break this down briefly, because I spoke just now about a driver being perception of a situation. The current situation in this case is that in recent years, Octo have been using patterns from Sociocracy 3.0. That's pretty clear and concrete. I don't think anybody's going to dispute that. But the current situation can be slippery, because our perception is slippery. So dialogue around the current situation can be useful to reveal a more nuanced point of view. It also talks here about the effect, or the anticipated effect, of this situation on the organization. In this case, it's retrospective, that pulling in these patterns has actually been shown to help the organization to create more value. What's needed is a more subjective opinion. In a way, you could look at it like a more or less concrete conclusion, or an experiment even. Something deficit. Yeah, so a deficit of a broader range of people knowing about S3, and the anticipated impact of responding to that need is to raise understanding of what S3 is and how it can be of help. So we'll see whether or not that works out today. You might be asking yourself at this point, well, why bother describing organizational drivers? Because it can seem like a bit of a pain. Why can't we just get on and do things? Well, in my experience, often when you ask people why they do things, they're not actually so clear. And even if an individual is clear why they're doing things, you ask a colleague why they're doing things, and they'll have a different idea. You ask people why their organization exists. What's the situation the organization exists to respond to? What's the assumption about what's needed? And often people are unclear. So clarifying drivers, clarifying the why, can be useful. It supports sense-making and meaning-making through dialogue between people and coming to realize people have different perceptions and different ideas. It helps to build shared understanding, to improve communication between people, and to communicate with others about situations that might appear relevant to you, and also to remember why things were done. I heard a story about a bank in Sweden. And in the 1960s, there was a bunch of directors, many of whom now have passed on. And a few years ago, there was a fire safety inspection. And the fire safety officer was outraged to find the attic of the bank full of newspapers. In fact, every daily newspaper that had been published since 1965 until the current day was in that attic. And he was freaked out. So he asked, why are the newspapers there? Nobody knew. So they began to investigate, and eventually they found a PA somewhere in the organization. On their job description, it said, buy a copy of every daily newspaper every day and put it in the attic. And people said, but why? Why do that? She said, no idea. Anyway, it turns out that in 1965, this director couldn't find his favorite newspaper, and he was furious. So he told someone at the time, buy a copy of every daily newspaper every day and put it in that attic so I can find it if I want it. And so they did. And they've been doing it ever since, and he died in the 1970s. I'll let you play with that metaphor and consider parallel relevance in other contexts in your life. So, clear why, useful. Why are we doing what we're doing? That's a great place to start. Secondarily, though, clear expectations. People talk about organizations like living systems. I think that's a partly useful analogy, but an organization is also a sum of agreements as well. It's like relational contracts that people have with one another. And this brings me to the second concept from S3, domain. When I say domain, I mean a distinct area of influence, activity, or decision-making in your organization. All organizations divide into domains, formal and informal. Individuals and groups of people gather together to handle distinct areas of influence, activity, and decision-making. In S3, we have a pattern called delegate influence. I spoke with Dave at dinner a couple of days ago, and as usual, some of what he said challenged my existing ideas, and I want to just explain a little bit what I mean by delegate. Delegate is about how we distribute responsibilities and influence throughout organizational systems. So any organization, as it grows, here we've got 3 ambitious pioneers in a startup. Any organization, as it grows, you'll see there might be a clear driver to start with, but before long you realize there's many other things to take care of as well. And so what we see here in this illustration is that at some point, these ambitious founders realize that it's beyond the scope of their ability to handle everything themselves, and so they decide to share some of that with others. They clarify a subdomain around one of those significant drivers that enjoy others to take responsibility for and help them with. Delegate influence, in the way we define it, refers to clarifying the domain and delegating it to others who consciously take responsibility for the domain. And we refer to these 2 kind of characters as delegator and delegatee, or delegatees. What's less appreciated often is the fact that a delegator shares accountability for responsibilities that they delegate. In any organizational system, there's a hierarchy of accountability, whether it's from a few to the many, or in a community context, what I would refer to as a bottomarchy, from the many to the few. You've heard the expression, where the buck stops. Okay, well, follow that path and it leads you to insight into the hierarchy of accountability. So, important to recognize, if you're delegating responsibility to others, you're distributing power to influence, then you share some accountability for that. It's not an excuse to blame it on others. And, even more importantly, provide support and opportunity for learning and development to those people who generously, kindly, and willingly decided to help you out with that. Yeah. So, as a delegator delegating influence, a useful question to ask is, what are the minimum necessary constraints that will enable delegatees to respond to this driver and create value as effectively as possible? So I'm not talking about prison cells here. I'm just asking the question, what are useful constraints that are going to enable those people who take responsibility for this to create value as effectively as they can? In S3, we also decided to describe a pattern we see out there in the world called clarify and develop domains. So some of you have obviously seen job descriptions before, or maybe project descriptions or team descriptions. We offer a template with some ideas about useful aspects to consider when clarifying a domain. Besides just the primary driver and those essential things that should be taken care of, it's useful to think about things like key challenges as well. Any key deliverables which, in my opinion, generally should emerge from the sense-making and decision-making of the people who take responsibility for the domain. Delegator responsibilities, that's a good one, not to overlook, and also key metrics and how you're going to measure success as well. When you clarify a domain, this isn't about creating a description and then putting it in the drawer and never looking at it again. One, it's a binding agreement between delegator and delegatee. It also provides insight to others who might have an interest in this. But more importantly, I think, it gives you a starting point upon which you can iterate to continuously evolve a domain's design over time based on outcomes and what you learn, and on dialogue between delegator and delegatees. This is a living document that records the wisdom of those that came before. A clearly defined domain is going to help with recruitment, because people are going to know what they're agreeing to take responsibility for. It helps with delegation ongoingly throughout an organization, and also with evaluating work. And as I said, regularly reviewing and improving a domain's design helps you to keep this record of wisdom alive in the organization. Clear strategy. So in S3, we described the pattern clarify and develop strategy. There are many ways to develop strategy, and there are many people much more experienced than me to speak to you about that. But in essence, what we mean by strategy is a high-level approach for how people create value to successfully account for a domain. And a clear strategy guides value creation, and it provides a general sense of direction. I'm not talking about alignment down to a minute degree, but just a general sense of how we're going about responding to that driver somehow. And also, people with responsibility for domains throughout the organization can develop strategy too. I spoke about a hierarchy of accountability. In an organization, you have a hierarchy of drivers, the primary driver for the organization, and all those other drivers that emerge over time as people respond to that, but also a hierarchy of strategy. And having coherence, how people account for domains on the meta and micro throughout a system, helps to maintain coherence and to rapidly identify when there's need for change or things need to improve. So strategy can be developed not just globally, but also by people locally too. By the way, with those kids, we used to come together regularly. We had a strategy for the Teens and Toddlers project as a whole, but we also worked with those kids on the micro level to develop strategy for how they would make interventions with their small child. And as a team supporting a group of teenagers, we also developed strategy and continuously adapted and improved it among those trainee facilitators and others involved in that particular team as well. So, structure. In S3, we defined what we saw as patterns for building organizations. A common one is role. And also, in many organizations, it would seem that people enjoy using something we called teams, a group of people collaborating towards a common driver. Circle is one type of team. I hear this term get used and abused. I'm going to explain more what I mean later. Helping team. An open domain, I'm not going to go into these today, but in essence, these are three different types of team in terms of the properties that you observe in them. And also representative, which I'll explain a little more later too, and linking and double linking too. Ways to flow information and influence between domains. Back in 2014, we asked the question, what patterns can we see out there for structuring organizations? The Sociocratic Circle method and holacracy spoke about a double-linked hierarchy, but there were other patterns too. There are numerous patterns emergent today, and in fact, I would argue there is no one specific pattern. There's just inspiration as you look at different ways in which organizational systems evolve. But back then, we did name a few of those patterns, the delegate circle and service circle, the idea of peach organization and service organization, double-linked hierarchy and fractal organization as well. I won't go into these today, but you'll find more information about those online. I'll come back to delegate circle later. But one thing to think about in terms of organizations, and that segues with this next point of responsiveness, is how do you enable the evolution of an organizational structure that enables the flow of information, the distribution of influence, in ways that enable individuals and the organization as a whole to create maximal value. So, responsiveness then. We've clarified our driver, the organizational system has grown, influence has been distributed throughout the organization, there's been clarity on the minimal necessary constraints to enable people locally and to work together effectively as a whole. We have a general sense of direction by strategy and a structure. But the next point here segues with what Dave was referring to earlier as human sensor networks. So another pattern in S3 that we described is navigating via tension. When I say tension, I mean an inner state of alert. Okay? So as you're going through life, and you perceive a situation that appears to be different to what you would expect or wish to see, you'll be alerted to that situation. And the way you're alerted to it is through some inner sense of tension. Navigate via tension is an invitation to pause between stimulus and response. We're habitual creatures. We develop habits on the basis of what works. But with habituation comes unconsciousness too, and also, as I said earlier, perception is slippery. So it's useful to back up sometimes and double-check what it is we think we perceive. Navigate via tension goes like this. Notice tension. In fact, just take a moment. Bring awareness to your inner state right now. How are you sitting? What's alive in you? How do you feel? Physically, emotionally? Where are your thoughts? Are you aware of the chair you're sitting on, the texture of your clothes on your body? How often do you stop to listen in each day and to this fine-tuned device that is alerting you every moment in the environment in which you navigate? So noticing tension is useful. And when you become aware of a situation that appears to matter, investing time into understanding why. This segues with describing drivers. And asking yourself, is this situation relevant? I'm sure many of you have got distracted in the middle of the day when you've got important things on, and you suddenly find yourself doing something else, almost without thinking about it, and then realize it's not really in response to something that's relevant for the time. So is it responding to this situation important? Does it help the organization? Does it lead to harm if we don't? If yes, then you want to bring that into the consciousness of the system. That might be your responsibility. It might be something you can't respond to alone or can't respond to at all. So then who is responsible? Passing on that information. This is why learning to describe a driver simply and clearly is useful, because it provides you with a bundle of data you can communicate to others with as well. Yourself or others responding, and then most importantly, reflecting on outcomes, regularly evaluating and improving based on what you learn. So, drivers, summarized, are useful, as I said, for providing this bundle of data that you can pass to others. I want to add a caveat before I go on here, because I often hear people say, oh yeah, well, it's not my responsibility, so I'll just leave the fire to burn. And I think there's something important to recognize there, which segues with what I was saying about taking some responsibility for the organization as a whole. If you can take care of it yourself without causing undesirable consequences, then please do so. Don't leave it for someone else to deal with later. But in the case where it's beyond the scope of you dealing with it for some reason or other, then do what is best to do, which is to pass that information on to individuals or to people in teams. So, focused on value. As I said, the purpose of an organization is to create value in response to human needs. And there's a couple of ways that people respond to organizational drivers. One of them is what we refer to as governance. This is another key concept from S3. When I say governance, I mean the act of setting objectives and making and evolving decisions that guide people toward achieving them. And then operations, which is about doing the work and organizing day-to-day activities within the constraints defined through that governance. Governance is like building the banks of the river, and ideally continuously adapting them to guide the creative flow. So, billions has been invested at this point into helping people develop more agile and lean operations. So I'm not going to spend much time on that today, but we did document a few patterns that are probably familiar for you, like visualizing work and prioritizing work, having a pull system for work rather than pushing work onto people, and maybe even limiting work in progress so you can focus on getting some things finished before you start something new. Planning and review meetings, daily stand-ups, retrospectives, and so on. If you don't know about these patterns, then I suggest you check them out, because they're pretty useful for organizing and handling work. But the Achilles heel in an organization that's seeking to navigate, especially in complexity, and is looking to distribute influence throughout the system in ways that enable that organization to become more responsive, is when it comes to handling governance decisions. Traditionally, governance is often handled by individuals, for example, managers, in what we have come to know as managed teams. Gerard Endenberg in the 70s, it wasn't new, but he made explicit the notion of shifting from individuals making decisions to groups making decisions in self-governing teams, which is what I was referring to earlier with the term circle. Group of people responding to a common driver, handling not just operations, but governance within that domain as well. I think at this stage, there's a huge underappreciation for us and our children that follow, learning how to collaboratively make and evolve agreements together and to approach that in an iterative and incremental way. We could sum that up as agile governance. But I often hear people say, but that takes time, and it takes effort, and oh, it's so much slower than it was before. Number one, I think it's slow because we don't know how to do it. Number two, maybe because we're used to trying to agree on the big plan instead of taking an iterative and incremental approach. So if you are going to distribute the function of management throughout the system, one of which is governance, then you need to invest in people learning how to do that together in a more effective way. So this question, when to make a group decision? Well, when you're responding to new, complicated or complex situations. To harness, experience diversity, dissent, and novelty. Seeking the utility in disagreement. Moving beyond either or to both and more, and taking a more synergistic approach and an experimental approach to how we proceed. Increasing ownership of decisions, and why that's useful is even when it might seem like an overinvestment of time to come to an agreement together, the consequence will be is our decision, not yours. We will have a sense of shared ownership over that decision, rather than a sense of something that was done unto us somehow. So effective collaborative governance isn't about doing everything together, but it's asking the question, how do we free people up to create value as effectively as possible for themselves? So I mentioned earlier organizational structure, and I said I'd come back to delegate circle. So just briefly as an aside, people often say, yeah, but how do you handle dependencies in an organization? And there's many ways to do that. One pattern that we observed and appears to be useful is what we've called delegate circle, which is basically a bottom-archic structure where people from various operational domains select representatives to come together around a backlog and make and evolve governance decisions on behalf of those people whom they serve. The most informal example of a delegate circle you're going to see is a conversation around a coffee machine where people make an on-the-fly agreement. That happens quite often, and I think if it can happen there, great, because it avoids any other overhead. The one thing I'd add, though, is it's helpful to record that agreement and then evaluate it at some point later, and maybe even clarify who's responsible for what while you're at it as well, because otherwise things sometimes don't happen at all. So delegate circle, a useful way of handling dependencies across domains, and another way of managing several domains without necessarily delegating influence to someone in what we would refer to as a management role. So last two concepts I mentioned. Agreement. I think most of you understand what I mean by that. We're referring to a guideline, process, protocol or policy that's designed to guide the flow of value, which is why it's useful to regularly evaluate them and make sure that it does. And objection. Objection is something that needs some understanding, I think. There's some nuance involved. I'm referring to an argument that reveals consequences you are clear you want to avoid, an argument that reveals risks you'd rather avoid, or an argument that demonstrates worthwhile ways to improve. We don't want to settle for mediocrity. Life is short and precious. It goes by super fast. We want to make the best use of our limited time, energy, and resources. So let's reach out to distributed intelligence to identify not only when we're heading in a direction that's going to lead to consequences we'd rather didn't occur, or expose us to risks that we're not prepared to take, but also to learn from one another so we can continuously improve. Something many of you might have heard of is consent decision-making. This was developed by Endenberg to get beyond the perils of consensus decision-making. The absence of any objection among stakeholders equals something that appears to be good enough for now and safe enough to try. This agile approach to governance is about developing safe-to-fail experiments that we can learn from, fail fast if necessary, and proceed with this iterative and incremental approach. Consent decision-making shifts supremacy from individuals or groups to arguments that qualify as objections. So the responsibility of the people is bringing forward arguments, testing them, and among those various stakeholders, considering whether or not they qualify. I spoke about the importance of a culture that supports ongoing learning and development, and as you've seen, I've regularly referred throughout this talk today the importance of coming back to things to evaluate and reflect and learn and evolve. An organization that's navigating via tension doesn't need to upfront plan how that structure should evolve. If we go back to our startup, essentially what we see over time is that as the organization grows and people respond to drivers both in the governance and operational domains, an organizational structure can emerge that is continuously adapting to enable creation of value throughout that system as a whole. So we're kind of learning retrospectively about what works, often through what doesn't and the changes we make to accommodate that. S3 provides numerous patterns that support ongoing learning and development. I've referenced some today. Adopt the 7 principles, involve those affected, linking between domains, retrospectives, reflecting on how we do the work, taking regular moments to consider how we might improve. Consent decision-making and testing arguments qualify as objections is a pattern in its own right, and evaluating and evolving agreements, whatever they may be, based on what we learn. There's patterns that support a collaborative approach, not only to the decision-making, but the proposal forming as well. Evaluating meetings, that's useful. If you don't have time to evaluate your meeting, take double the time next time to learn how you can conduct your meetings on time. Peer review, development plan, and so on. But S3, while it's a menu of patterns, the patterns in themselves are a means to an end. It doesn't really matter whether or not a specific pattern is especially useful for you, but it's more the fact that in a moment when you consider alternatives, it gives you a chance not only to reflect on those alternatives, but to become more conscious of what you habitually do as well. At the interface between the habitual and the new, potential for greater consciousness resides. So, behind the patterns, S3 is about developing a more agile and sociocratic mindset. I say that reservedly after what Dave said about the term mindset, but I just mean that perspective of thinking in a more nuanced and iterative way. Using limited time, energy, and resources wisely, that's the lean aspect of S3. Being open to reason, but also testing assumptions and applying learning to continuously improve, and recognizing we need each other to make sense of the world and navigate its complexity. None of this could be without us having developed as cooperative creatures and learning how to work together to survive and thrive in this complex world. And practicing reflexivity. Reflexivity is an interesting idea. It's reflecting for, in, and on action. It's like expanding your awareness and therefore your consciousness across time, mindful of what came before, open to what's emerging in the moment, considering where you think you might want to go, and then keeping awareness across that spectrum so that you can continuously identify nuance, new information, and learn. So finally then, culture of collaboration. How do you create that? Well, I don't think you can. It's not something you can pull out of the box. Culture is a consequence of the sum of all of those other parts. Jordan Peterson, another controversial figure for some, something he said once really stood out for me. If you find yourself self-conscious about your inadequacies, seek to reduce your inadequacies, not your self-consciousness. Finally then, that brings me to one pattern from S3 that I think is so simple to understand, but it's damn near one of the hardest ones to apply day to day. Artful participation. When I was working with those teenagers, I learned very fast it didn't matter how good a facilitator I was. If those kids weren't on board and engaged and asking the question, how can I make the greatest contribution to the effectiveness of this collaboration, then we were screwed. Yeah, effectiveness is dependent on people. It's dependent on all of us. It's dependent on everyone asking, how can I bring my best to this collaboration? Was that the end of my presentation? I think there was one more slide here, folks. So let me just wrap up, because you might be feeling a bit like this right now. And if you are, then I just want to simplify this somehow. How and where do I start? Start by making sense of where you are. Remember, much of what we have today is already good enough as it is. So celebrate what works. Amplify it somehow. Identify and prioritize those important drivers, and pull in patterns that might help. And then take that experimental approach. Regularly evaluate outcomes so that you can continuously learn and improve. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you.